Picture this. You're 7 years old, clutching a small wooden toy your mother carved for you, when strange hands pull you away from everything you've ever known. Your parents aren't weeping, they're relieved. You've just become what medieval society called an oblate, a child literally donated to God like a piece of property. As the heavy wooden gates of the convent slam shut behind you, you have no idea that you'll never see your family again, never taste your mother's cooking, never play in sunlit fields. You've just entered a world where childhood as we know it simply doesn't exist. This wasn't an isolated tragedy. This was Tuesday in medieval Europe. For over 800 years, from roughly 500 to 1300 CE, European convents and monasteries operated what can only be described as a systematic program of child absorption. Families routinely surrendered children as young as 5 to religious institutions, not out of divine calling, but for reasons ranging from poverty to political convenience. What happened to these children behind convent walls would horrify modern parents and challenge everything we think we know about medieval Christianity. The stories that follow aren't tales of gentle nuns teaching prayers to willing pupils. They're accounts of systematic brutality, psychological manipulation, and the complete erasure of childhood itself. These children, known as oblates, lived lives that were simultaneously privileged and tortured, educated and isolated, blessed and cursed. Welcome to the dark side of medieval spirituality, where children paid the ultimate price for adults' earthly concerns. The practice of child ablation wasn't a medieval invention. It stretched back to the early Christian church. But by the height of the Middle Ages, it had become a sophisticated system of human trafficking disguised as religious devotion. Parents could literally sign away their children's futures with a simple ceremony, and once those papers were signed, there was no going back. The process was disturbingly businesslike. Families would approach a convent or monastery, often during times of economic hardship, and negotiate terms. Sometimes money changed hands, the family paying the institution to take their child. Other times, the child came with a dowry of land or livestock. In the most desperate cases, children were simply abandoned at convent gates with notes pinned to their clothing. But here's what makes this practice particularly chilling. These weren't teenagers making informed decisions about their spiritual futures. These were toddlers, preschoolers, children who still needed help tying their shoes. The average age of ablation was between 5 and 7 years old, though some records document children as young as 3 being handed over to religious institutions. Once the ceremony was complete, often involving the child being symbolically wrapped in the altar cloth, their fate was sealed. Medieval law considered these children legally dead to their families. They couldn't inherit property, couldn't marry, couldn't leave the institution, and in most cases, couldn't even correspond with their parents. They had become, in every legal and social sense, the property of the church. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Imagine being a 5-year-old who doesn't understand why mommy and daddy aren't coming back. These children would cry for weeks, refuse to eat, and desperately try to escape. But the convent walls were high, the gates were locked, and the world outside had already forgotten they existed. Some children were fortunate enough to be oblate with siblings, but even this small comfort was often stripped away. Convents deliberately separated family members to prevent worldly attachments from interfering with spiritual development. Brothers and sisters might live in the same building for years without being allowed to speak to each other. The most heartbreaking aspect of the ablation process was its permanence. Unlike modern adoption, where children might maintain some connection to their birth families, medieval ablation was designed to create a complete break with the past. These children weren't joining a new family. They were being erased from their old one and rebuilt from scratch according to monastic ideals. Modern child development experts understand that play is essential for healthy psychological growth. Medieval convents viewed play as the devil's workshop. From the moment oblate children arrived at their new home, every aspect of their natural childhood behavior was systematically suppressed. Laughter was discouraged as frivolous. Running was forbidden except in designated areas. Toys were confiscated and destroyed, replaced with prayer beads and religious texts the children couldn't yet read. The daily schedule for oblate children was rigid beyond belief. They woke at 3 a.m. for the first prayers of the day, attended multiple religious services, performed manual labor appropriate to their age, studied Latin and scripture, and fell into bed exhausted by sunset. There was no free time, no play periods, no opportunity for the kind of imaginative exploration that we now know is crucial for developing minds. But perhaps most disturbing was the systematic suppression of emotional expression. Children who cried were punished for showing weakness. Those who laughed too loudly faced correction for disturbing the sacred silence. Any display of homesickness, fear, or natural childhood exuberance was treated as a spiritual failing that needed to be beaten out of them, sometimes literally. The concept of individual personality was considered dangerous. Oblate children weren't encouraged to develop their unique interests or talents. Instead, they were molded into identical, interchangeable units in the great machine of medieval religious life. A child who showed artistic ability might have their hands bound to prevent drawing. One who displayed natural leadership might be deliberately humiliated to crush their confidence. Physical contact was virtually eliminated from these children's lives. Hugs, affectionate touches, even handshakes were forbidden as potential sources of worldly attachment. Some children went years without experiencing human warmth beyond the necessary contact during medical treatment or physical punishment. The psychological effects were profound and lasting. Many oblate children developed what we would now recognize as severe attachment disorders. They struggled to form emotional connections with anyone, having learned that all relationships were temporary and dangerous. Some became aggressive and violent, lashing out at the only world they knew. Others retreated into complete passivity, becoming living ghosts who went through the motions of religious life without any spark of genuine humanity. Perhaps most tragically, these children often lost the ability to imagine any other way of life. By adolescence, many oblates couldn't conceive of existence outside convent walls. They had been so thoroughly conditioned that the outside world became literally unimaginable. Not because they chose religious life, but because they had been psychologically broken to the point where choice itself was meaningless. Medieval convents didn't just house children, they educated them. But the education these oblate children received was unlike anything we would recognize today. It was a systematic program designed to strip away individual identity and replace it with unquestioning religious obedience. The academic curriculum was limited and heavily controlled. Children learned to read but only religious texts. They studied Latin but only to better understand church services. Mathematics was taught only insofar as it related to calculating feast days and managing convent resources. History, science, literature, and philosophy, the subjects that might encourage independent thinking, were either forbidden entirely or heavily censored to exclude any ideas that might challenge church authority. But the real education happened in the realm of discipline and punishment. Oblate children learned, through painful experience, that questioning authority brought swift retribution. They discovered that showing emotion led to isolation and humiliation. They were taught that their natural instincts, to play, to explore, to form friendships, were sinful impulses that needed constant vigilance to suppress. Physical punishment was not just common but systematically applied. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed most medieval religious communities, explicitly authorized beating children who were too young to understand the seriousness of excommunication. In practice, this meant that any child under 12 could be beaten for infractions that would merit only prayer or fasting for adults. The instruments of punishment were varied and creative. Wooden rods, leather straps, and knotted cords were standard tools. Some convents employed special discipline chambers, where children were taken for private beatings away from their peers. Others preferred public punishment as a teaching tool, forcing all the children to watch while one of their number was beaten for some transgression. But physical pain was just one element of a broader system of psychological control. Children who showed signs of independence might be subjected to weeks of solitary confinement. Those who formed friendships with other oblates could be separated and forbidden to speak to each other. Any child who expressed homesickness might be forced to publicly confess their sin of worldly attachment and beg forgiveness from the entire community. The most insidious aspect of this educational system was how it convinced children that they deserved their treatment. Through constant repetition and reinforcement, oblates learned that they were inherently sinful, that their suffering was necessary for their spiritual development, and that questioning their treatment was itself a sin worthy of even greater punishment. Some children internalized these lessons so completely that they became enforcers of the system themselves. Older oblates would monitor younger ones, reporting infractions and sometimes administering punishment themselves. This created a hierarchy of victimization where those who had suffered the longest became complicit in perpetuating the suffering of others. The physical conditions in medieval convents were harsh for everyone, but they were particularly brutal for growing children whose bodies had different nutritional and developmental needs than adults. Food was strictly rationed and designed more for spiritual discipline than physical health. Adult monks and nuns could theoretically understand the spiritual significance of fasting and dietary restrictions. Children simply experienced chronic hunger. Meals were sparse, consisting mainly of bread, porridge, and watered-down ale or wine. Meat was rare, dairy products were scarce, and fresh fruits and vegetables were luxuries reserved for special occasions. The impact on growing bodies was severe. Malnutrition was widespread among oblate children, leading to stunted growth, dental problems, and increased susceptibility to disease. Many children developed rickets from lack of sunlight and proper nutrition, resulting in permanent skeletal deformities. Others suffered from scurvy, anemia, and other nutritional deficiency diseases that we now know can cause permanent developmental damage. Sleep deprivation was another constant assault on these young bodies. The monastic schedule, designed for adult constitutions, required children to wake at 3 a.m. for the first prayers of the day and attend multiple services throughout the night. Growing children need significantly more sleep than adults, but oblates were expected to maintain the same rigorous schedule as their adult counterparts. The result was a population of chronically exhausted children whose physical and mental development was severely compromised. Medical care was primitive at best and often counterproductive. Illness was frequently viewed as a spiritual failing rather than a physical condition requiring treatment. Sick children might be subjected to additional fasting, prayer, or even physical punishment as cures for their ailments. Bloodletting was common, further weakening already malnourished young bodies. Many treatable conditions became chronic disabilities or death sentences due to neglect or inappropriate treatment. Personal hygiene was another area where children suffered disproportionately. Bathing was rare and often viewed with suspicion as a form of vanity or sensual indulgence. Children might go months without proper washing, leading to skin diseases, parasitic infestations, and other health problems. Dental care was non-existent beyond the extraction of severely problematic teeth, usually without any form of anesthesia. The psychological stress of convent life also manifested in physical symptoms. Many oblate children developed nervous disorders, digestive problems, and other stress-related conditions. Some engaged in self-harm as a way of expressing emotions they weren't allowed to verbalize. Others developed eating disorders, either refusing food entirely or hoarding whatever scraps they could find. Perhaps most disturbing was the attitude toward these physical sufferings. Rather than being seen as problems to be addressed, the pain and discomfort experienced by oblate children were often celebrated as signs of spiritual progress. A malnourished child was praised for their dedication to fasting. A sleepless child was commended for their devotion to prayer. This twisted interpretation of suffering meant that many health problems went not just untreated, but were actively encouraged as virtuous behavior. One of the most profound tragedies of the oblate system was how it robbed children of any meaningful choice about their adult lives. These weren't young adults choosing religious vocations. They were toddlers whose entire futures were decided by others before they had developed the cognitive capacity to understand what was happening to them. By the time oblate children reached adolescence, they faced a cruel paradox. They had been raised in an environment so isolated and controlled that they lacked the knowledge, skills, and psychological preparation necessary to survive in the outside world. Yet they had never made a conscious choice to embrace religious life. They were trapped in an existence they neither chose nor could escape. The legal reality made their situation even more hopeless. Medieval law treated oblate children as having made irrevocable vows, even though those vows had been made on their behalf when they were too young to understand their meaning. Attempting to leave religious life was considered apostasy, a crime punishable by excommunication, imprisonment, or even death. The few oblates who tried to escape faced a world that viewed them as criminals and outcasts. For those who remained, adult life offered little improvement over their childhood experiences. They became monks or nuns not through spiritual calling but through having no other choice. Many struggled with depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues that we now recognize as symptoms of childhood trauma. Some became harsh disciplinarians themselves, perpetuating the cycle of abuse they had experienced. Others retreated into mental illness or complete emotional withdrawal. The system was particularly cruel to young women. Female oblates faced additional restrictions and dangers beyond those experienced by their male counterparts. In some convents, the combination of isolation, malnutrition, and psychological stress led to outbreaks of what medieval chroniclers called religious mania, episodes of mass hysteria, self-harm, and bizarre behavior that modern psychologists would recognize as symptoms of severe trauma and mental illness. Even more disturbing were the documented cases of sexual abuse within religious institutions. The same isolation that was supposed to protect children from worldly corruption also made them vulnerable to predators within their own communities. Children who had been taught absolute obedience to religious authority were particularly defenseless against abuse by the very people charged with their spiritual care. The economic aspect of the oblate system also trapped these children in a form of institutionalized slavery. Their labor, whether in copying manuscripts, maintaining buildings, or producing goods for sale, generated income for the religious community, but the oblates themselves owned nothing and could claim no compensation for their work. They were, in effect, unpaid laborers whose childhood had been purchased by their parents' donation to the church. Perhaps most heartbreaking were the rare cases where oblates did manage to reconnect with their birth families. By then, they had become strangers to the people who had given them away. Years of institutional life had left them unable to form normal family relationships. They had missed crucial developmental experiences, first loves, career choices, the gradual assumption of adult responsibility that their siblings had taken for granted. They were simultaneously overeducated in religious matters and completely unprepared for ordinary adult life. Despite the systematic oppression they faced, not all oblate children submitted passively to their fate. The historical record, though heavily filtered through the perspective of religious authorities, contains numerous accounts of resistance, rebellion, and desperate attempts at escape. Some children engaged in subtle forms of resistance that wouldn't immediately provoke punishment. They might deliberately perform their duties poorly, forget instructions, or find ways to communicate with other children despite prohibitions against friendship. These small acts of defiance were crucial for maintaining some sense of individual identity in an environment designed to crush all traces of personal autonomy. More dramatic forms of resistance included attempted escapes, violent outbursts, and deliberate violations of religious rules. Some children tried to scale convent walls, hide in supply wagons leaving the grounds, or simply walk out through unlocked gates during moments of confusion. Most were quickly recaptured and subjected to severe punishment, but their attempts demonstrate that the spirit of rebellion wasn't entirely crushed by institutional control. Self-harm was another form of resistance, though a tragic one. Some children deliberately injured themselves to avoid work duties or religious services. Others engaged in self-destructive behavior as a way of asserting control over their own bodies when every other aspect of their lives was controlled by others. While these actions were undoubtedly cries for help, they were typically interpreted by religious authorities as signs of demonic possession or spiritual corruption, requiring even harsher treatment. Group rebellions were rare but not unheard of. There are documented cases of multiple oblate children engaging in coordinated acts of defiance, refusing to attend services, destroying religious artifacts, or staging hunger strikes. These collective actions were particularly threatening to religious authorities because they demonstrated that the children could organize and support each other despite official attempts to prevent friendship and solidarity. Some older oblates found ways to protect younger children from the worst aspects of institutional life. They might share food with hungry newcomers, provide comfort to homesick children, or try to shield the youngest oblates from particularly harsh punishments. These acts of compassion were themselves violations of convent rules, but they show that human empathy could survive even in the most dehumanizing environments. The most successful form of resistance was intellectual. Some oblate children became voracious readers, educating themselves beyond the narrow curriculum imposed by their religious instructors. They memorized secular poetry, studied forbidden subjects, and maintained mental lives that their overseers couldn't control. This intellectual resistance sometimes paid off in adulthood, as some former oblates became influential scholars, reformers, or critics of the very system that had oppressed them. Perhaps most importantly, some oblates found ways to maintain hope for a different future. They made secret plans for escape, formed clandestine friendships that sustained them through their darkest moments, or simply refused to accept that their current situation was permanent. This psychological resistance was perhaps the most crucial factor in determining which children would emerge from the oblate system with their humanity intact. The effects of the oblate system didn't end when these children reached adulthood. For many, the trauma of their early experiences shaped the rest of their lives in profound and often destructive ways. Former oblates who remained in religious life often became the harshest enforcers of the same system that had brutalized them. Having internalized the belief that suffering was necessary for spiritual development, they inflicted on the next generation of children the same cruelties they had endured. This created cycles of abuse that could persist for generations within individual religious communities. Those few who managed to leave religious life faced enormous challenges adjusting to the outside world. They lacked basic social skills, had no experience with normal family relationships, and often struggled with severe anxiety when confronted with the freedom to make choices. Many found it impossible to form intimate relationships, having been conditioned from childhood to view emotional attachments as dangerous and sinful. The economic impact was also severe. Former oblates typically had no property, no family connections to provide support, and no experience with financial management. They had been trained for religious life, not secular careers, and often found themselves destitute and unemployable in the wider world. Some became beggars, others turned to crime, and many simply died young from poverty and neglect. Mental health problems were endemic among former oblates. Depression, anxiety, and what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder were common. Some developed elaborate phobias related to their childhood experiences, fears of enclosed spaces, authority figures, or religious symbols. Others suffered from dissociative disorders, essentially disconnecting from their own experiences as a psychological defense mechanism. The impact on their own children when former oblates did manage to have families was often tragic. Having no model for healthy parenting, many former oblates either became neglectful or excessively controlling parents. Some were so damaged by their own experiences that they couldn't form emotional bonds with their children. Others overcompensated by being permissive to the point of neglect, unable to provide the structure and guidance that children need. Some former oblates became advocates for reform, using their experiences to push for changes in how religious institutions treated children. Their testimonies, when they survived in historical records, provide some of our most detailed accounts of life inside medieval convents and monasteries. However, their voices were often dismissed by contemporary authorities as the complaints of malcontents who had failed to appreciate the spiritual benefits of their upbringing. The psychological concept of learned helplessness explains much about how former oblates struggled in adult life. Having been taught from early childhood that they had no control over their circumstances, many never developed the confidence and decision-making skills necessary for independent living. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to follow orders that freedom itself became a source of overwhelming anxiety. Perhaps most tragically, many former oblates struggled with questions of identity and purpose throughout their lives. Having been stripped of their original family connections and natural development, they often felt like strangers to themselves. They had been shaped so completely by institutional life that they didn't know who they might have become under different circumstances. This existential confusion could persist for decades, making it difficult for them to find meaning or satisfaction in adult life. To fully understand the horror of the oblate system, it's important to recognize that it had powerful defenders who genuinely believed they were acting in the children's best interests. The medieval mind operated with assumptions about childhood, spirituality, and human nature that seem alien to modern sensibilities, but these beliefs provided a moral framework that allowed good people to participate in what we would now recognize as systematic child abuse. Religious authorities argued that early ablation was actually a form of mercy, rescuing children from the spiritual corruption of secular life and ensuring their salvation. In an age when infant mortality was high and eternal damnation was considered a real and immediate threat, parents were told that giving their children to the church was the most loving thing they could do. The temporary suffering of earthly life was seen as insignificant compared to the eternal benefits of religious training. The theological justification was sophisticated and deeply rooted in medieval Christian thought. Children were considered to be born in sin, their natural impulses inherently corrupt and dangerous. The harsh discipline of monastic life was seen as necessary medicine, bitter but healing. Just as a loving parent might force a child to take unpleasant medicine for their physical health, religious authorities argued that they were forcing spiritual medicine on children for their eternal welfare. Medical knowledge of the time also supported the system's defenders. Medieval understanding of child development was rudimentary at best. The psychological needs that we now know are crucial for healthy development, emotional security, play, social interaction, were either unknown or dismissed as irrelevant. Many religious authorities genuinely believed that children were essentially miniature adults who could benefit from the same spiritual disciplines that helped mature monks and nuns. Economic arguments also played a role in defending the system. In an age of frequent famines and economic uncertainty, religious institutions argued that they were providing food, shelter, and education that many families couldn't afford. The children might suffer in the short term, but they were receiving opportunities for literacy and learning that would have been impossible in their birth families. This argument was particularly compelling during times of economic crisis when parents faced the choice between giving their children to the church or watching them starve. Some of the system's most articulate defenders were former oblates themselves. These individuals, having found meaning and purpose in religious life, argued that their childhood suffering had been necessary for their spiritual development. Their testimonies were particularly powerful because they couldn't be dismissed as the opinions of outsiders who didn't understand monastic life. These defenders often claimed that they were grateful for having been spared the spiritual dangers of secular life, even if the price had been childhood trauma. The intellectual elite of medieval society also supported the oblate system on philosophical grounds. Influenced by classical authors like Aristotle and Plato, who had argued that individual desires should be subordinated to the greater good, medieval thinkers saw the sacrifice of individual children for the benefit of religious communities as morally justified. The pain of a few was acceptable if it served the spiritual needs of many. Legal scholars provided another layer of justification by arguing that parents had absolute authority over their children, including the right to dedicate them to religious service. This wasn't seen as child abuse but as legitimate parental decision-making, no different from arranging a marriage or choosing a career for one's offspring. The concept of children's rights simply didn't exist in medieval legal thought. The oblate system officially ended in most of Europe by the late medieval period, but its psychological and cultural impacts echoed through the centuries. The children who survived these institutions carried their trauma into adulthood, affecting their relationships, their parenting, and their understanding of human nature itself. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this historical reality is how ordinary it seemed to the people living through it. These weren't isolated cases of abuse or the actions of particularly cruel individuals. This was a systematic, legal, socially accepted practice that affected thousands of children across centuries of European history. Good people, acting according to the moral and religious principles of their time, created and maintained a system that systematically destroyed childhood itself. The oblate system forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of childhood, authority, and social progress. How many practices that we consider normal today will be viewed as barbaric by future generations? What blind spots in our own moral vision allow us to perpetuate systems that harm the most vulnerable members of society? The stories of these medieval children also remind us that resilience and humanity can survive even the most systematic attempts at destruction. Some oblates did find ways to resist, to maintain their essential humanity, and to break the cycles of abuse they had experienced. Their survival and occasional triumph represent powerful testimony to the strength of the human spirit. Modern child welfare systems, for all their flaws, represent a fundamental recognition that children have rights and needs that are separate from adult agendas. The concept that children deserve protection, education, and the opportunity to develop their own identities is a relatively recent innovation in human history. The oblate system reminds us how precious and fragile these principles really are. As we look back at these medieval children, separated from us by centuries but connected by our shared humanity, we're reminded that progress is neither automatic nor irreversible. Every generation must choose whether to protect its most vulnerable members or sacrifice them to the demands of adult society. The children of medieval convents paid a terrible price for their elders' choices. Their stories serve as both a warning and a call to vigilance, reminding us that the price of civilization is constant attention to the welfare of those who cannot protect themselves. The gates of those medieval convents have long since crumbled into dust, but the questions they raise about power, childhood, and human dignity remain as relevant today as they were 800 years ago. In remembering these children, we honor their suffering and recommit ourselves to ensuring that such systematic destruction of innocence never again masquerades as virtue. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, share and comment below. See you in the next one.